Okay, we're back to chapter 5, part 6. This chapter is huge. We're going through Wicca and Witchcraft for Dummies, and right now we're talking about the past, about Wicca and Witchcraft, and a lot of the things that happened during the witch trials. So let's talk about what really happened. Uncovering the motives for the murders. The witch trials were not all alike. Anyone could be accused of being a witch. The alleged witches didn't share any common characteristic. In other words, all the witch trials that occurred in all locations don't represent an organized effort to exterminate any one type of person. However, much of the research shows that overall, approximately 80% of the accused were women, although the percentage shifted depending on the country. So were the accused people really witches? Most research indicates that the majority of the victims were Christians. However, evidence suggests that some of the accused mixed pagan beliefs and practices with Christianity. No one knows for sure how many were actually pagan witches believing in and practicing pre-Christian ways. In general, across all areas, the trials and the accompanying social panic don't appear to be a conspiracy solely against any one group. Even within a single area, those charged with witchcraft are almost always diverse. However, members of the following groups were often accused. For example, who would they take out? Women, especially unmarried women and widows who lived alone, because women weren't supposed to own property, right? So when their husbands passed away, the only way to gain access to that woman's property is for that woman no longer to own the property or no longer be physically on the property. That's a good point. They targeted the poor. They targeted the elderly, hence the image of the old woman hag in the bush who's ugly and haggard and awful looking. They accused them of hiding in the bushes to create spells and wreak havoc on society. They charged or accused anyone who was disliked or resented in the community. They accused the mentally or physically impaired. They included healers and midwives, people who owned property that others wanted. Maybe you just wanted your neighbor's farm and you didn't like your neighbor, so you would call them up and be like, hey, I mean, obviously not call, but you get my point. But they'd be like, hey, my neighbor is a witch. Can you prosecute them? And then suddenly that farm becomes yours. And they also took anybody who was named by someone else. So basically, women in covens were captured and then they were tortured in order to give up the names of their fellow witches. So I'm going to take this opportunity and show you something that I had to create. So this is my apple seed necklace. So for those of you who don't know, apple seeds a long, long time ago, back in the 1800s, apple seeds contained a great deal of cyanide. And ingesting apple seeds could actually make you very sick. So women in pagan and witchcraft sects or covens would create apple seed necklaces and sew them into the hems of their skirts and their dresses, because if they were ever captured by the Inquisition, they could swallow the seeds and take their own life before having to give up the name of their sisters. And as a Wiccan woman, I created this, collected every single one of these apple seeds, soaked them in water, put a needle through them, and strung them into a necklace to honor the women who died before me. So that's just a piece of history for you. So at the time of the witch hunt, society was undergoing big changes. A number of conditions caused society to be unstable. It could have contributed to the panic. So the following sections will describe these conditions. None of these explanations can account for all the witch trials. However, these conditions may have set the stage for witch hunts in many areas across Europe. In times of rapid change and intense conflict, fear and desperation affect every aspect of people's lives and what can drive people to commit acts that they normally wouldn't do. So let's talk about how economics played a part in it. By the end of the witch hunts, the economy of Europe was changing. The feudal system, which was based on agriculture and independent villages, was collapsing. Capitalism, which was based on industry and private property, was growing. Land shifted from communal property used by whole villages to private property reserved for use by a single person. During this time, illness and poverty were widespread. So at this time, when people were starving, alleged witches served as scapegoats for disease and famine that were rampant in these impoverished communities. Peasants blamed the alleged witch for the illness or the starvation of loved ones, or frequently failing to cure the illness if they didn't cause it in the first place. So they would basically blame the witches for the illness, and then when the witch couldn't cure the illness, they blamed her for not being able to cure it either. But the witchcraft trials also did something else that was rather important. It discouraged peasant uprisings by breeding distrust in the community. The more distrust you can cause between one side and the other, the less you pay attention to capitalism. The story of Wicca and witchcraft is the same story that's happening now. In some cases, the witch trials may have been a direct result of the battle for private land. Under local laws, a witch trial and execution sometimes allowed the witch hunter or someone else to confiscate the victim's land, just because. So how does medicine and education affect the witch trials? So during the era of the witch hunts, the church was taking control of medicine and medical treatment by institutionalizing training in medicine and regulating who was permitted to practice this new craft. Women traditionally had been responsible for healing, and many village wise women had vast knowledge of herbs or natural healing techniques or midwifery. So here's one of the theories that suggests that the newly church-sanctioned medical profession began to drive out traditional healers who were the only source of medical treatment for the majority of the population. Why? The witch hunts may have served to eliminate these wise women who were competition for modern physicians. So once again, the patriarchy comes in where women's knowledge is not as important as men's. Therefore, they want to control the narrative and who releases information to the public on what medicine really is, because women had no place in science or medicine. Now, at this exact same time that this was all happening, the church was also beginning to institutionalize education. So this is when schools and universities were being established, from which women, of course, were banned because, women didn't have a right to an education. But it meant in many communities, women were being forced out of jobs and positions of power that they had held once because they did not have the credentials that were now necessary. Even men from the working class, they didn't attend these elite schools either because the lack of opportunity ensured that the poor were forced to work in the early industries for inadequate wages. Shocker. You know how they like to say the patriarchy hurts men and women? So now we're going to look at how religion affected the witch hunts. At the peak of the witch hunts, the formerly strong Central Roman Catholic Church was actually collapsing, and it was fragmenting into different orders and sects. The Protestants separated from the Catholic Church and formed their own churches. This period of history, called the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, beginning in the early 16th century, was a time of conflict and bloody warfare among rival religious groups. Both the old and the new churches were unstable at that time. But like usual, at this time of instability, both the old and the new churches lashed out at anyone they perceived as a threat. And the witch crazes, widespread panic, and intensified witch hunting swept across Europe. The churches actually came to take over peasant festivals and celebrations that had their roots in old paganism, which created an even greater distance between the common villagers and the practitioners of the old ways. And yes, we will get into later on how the different festivals were stolen by certain religions, and we'll talk about that down the road. So in addition to having stamped out the last remnants of pagan belief and practice, the witch hunts may have actually stopped a resurgence of paganism, especially, except perhaps in areas such as the large forests of England, which are reported to have been filled with peasant squatters. So people basically had left and gone up into the woods and basically said, enough of this, we're just going to go do our thing up in the woods. Now, centuries later, a man named Gerald Gardner, who is the man widely regarded as the founder of modern Wicca, he claimed to have met the members of a coven who had been living on the edge of one of these forests in the 1930s. He reported that the coven had survived for hundreds of years, and he based his writings on the history that this group maintained. So who is Gerald Gardner? We should probably talk about that. If you ask a dozen Wiccans for their opinions of Gerald Gardner, you'll almost certainly receive a dozen different responses. Depending on who you ask, he's either the savior or the scoundrel of the modern craft. Whatever the truth is, his story's not boring. So Gerald Gardner lived much of his life in the Far East. He was a British civil servant. He was immensely interested in anthropology, folklore, religion, and magic, and he spent time studying the beliefs of many indigenous peoples, including the headhunters of Borneo. He retired and returned to England in the 1930s. Now, after returning to England, he studied the occult. During this exploration, he encountered a coven that many claim had been in existence for centuries, possibly from ancient times, located on the edge of the New Forest. A hereditary witch, a woman called Old Dorothy, and later reported to be Dorothy Clutterbuck, initiated him into the coven and into Wicca. But at that time, it was spelled with one C. Now it's spelled with two. So from his experience in that coven and doing his own research, he created a system of Wicca, which evolved into the Gardnerian Wicca, which is the New Age Wicca. There's a whole chapter about it. He was initiated in 1939, and he could not reveal or publish his experiences because at the time there was anti-witchcraft laws on the books in Britain, so you couldn't talk about these types of things. The laws carried heavy penalties, and they're one of the key reasons that the craft remained shrouded in secrecy throughout British history because it was illegal to talk about it. It wasn't even something you discussed. Gonna have to do part 7. Like, follow, and share.